Hi, welcome back to our fourth segment of the episode I'm calling "The Queen is Dead, Long Live the King." In our previous segment, I talked about the prophetic inevitability of the dissolution of Europe as a single political entity, and implied that that's going to have some ramifications in the future. When the EU, the European Union, breaks up, to whatever extent that's going to happen, as we've seen it already begin to do since England left that political bloc a couple years back. When that happens, there will be a void, political, financial, probably otherwise, that someone or something is going to have to step into. What could that be? So that's what the focus is of this segment. What is still to come? Well, there are some clues, but they're clues you're probably going to overlook unless you're being guided by the Holy Bible here. So we'll start with the idea that the Pope sent a letter of condolences to Prince Charles after the death of his mother, the Queen, and prior to or maybe immediately after his coronation. So he's either about to become king or has just become king when the Pope sent him that message. Now, why is that important? If you read the content of the letter, it's not very long, but the Pope Francis, does speak to the idea that Queen Elizabeth was an advocate of the gospel and lived by its principles and its messages, and that she was somehow part of the family of God who is blah, 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 blah. I mean, it was very kind of praiseworthy of her as an individual and her role as a Christian person. Now, why is that noteworthy? It's noteworthy because it's ecumenical. That's a big fancy word. If you don't know what it means, it essentially just means that, like, all of the churches are different, but they put aside their differences and unite on the things they have in common, which is Jesus, right? Jesus. So I believe in Jesus, therefore I'm the same as you, even though we're very different and we believe different specific things. But I believe in Jesus, so do you, therefore we're the same. So this is an ecumenical letter from the Pope. But that should alarm people who are familiar with Catholic doctrine, because the Queen was the head not of the Catholic Church, but of the Church of England. The Church of England is not the same as the Catholic Church. The Church of England gave rise to the Anglican Church, and then that in turn gave rise to the Episcopalian Church. None of those churches are Catholic. So when the Pope reaches out across denominational lines and essentially is kind of welcoming the former head of a different communion of Christianity into their own, into their own system, the Pope is essentially saying the Queen was one of them. They're all the same in Jesus. That's problematic. Now you may be saying, why is that problematic? That's the politically correct thing to do. Wouldn't the whole world be better if everybody felt that way? I'm like, fine, sure, it's politically correct, but it's not theologically correct. Catholic doctrine is such that they believe they are the only true Christian communion, and that everybody else is essentially fakers. Without the fullness of salvation to offer. And so, lest you think that I'm being intolerant or any other thing you can accuse me of, here's an article. I believe it's from the Boston Globe, but this was published by the Associated Press. So the Boston Globe is not the only one that ran this article. It's from 2007. And it records some statements from the Pope at the time, Pope Benedict, about how everything I just said is the truth. The Catholic Church is the only true communion. It's the only one that has the fullness of salvation. Every other denomination is defective in some way, is essentially what he says. And this Pope is still alive. It's rare for two popes to be alive at the same time. He stepped out of the office, so now that's why we have Pope Francis. But the dude is still alive, and he's actually considered inside of the Catholic system to be one of the greatest modern theologians, more so than the current pope. And so when the Catholic people who pay attention to theology and care about it a lot, when they look at these two popes, which one are they listening to? Are they listening to the current guy who's so ecumenical and has gone on record saying things like, well, who am I to judge your sexual preferences, Or are they looking to the previous guy who says, actually, this church has stood for specific things for 2,000 years, and I nor you have the ability to change that, so here's what we believe, and here's why it's the truth, And whether you believe that what they believe is the truth or not is not really what we're talking about. They believe it's the truth. Pope Benedict believes that the Catholic system is the only one that can offer the fullness of salvation. He believes that because that was established Catholic doctrine for 2,000 years. And so, when we're in a moment in time where the leader of that system, the visible current leader of that system, Pope Francis, reaches out in this ecumenical way to a system, the leader of a system that doesn't have the fullness of salvation, is defective according to their own thinking, that is noteworthy. It's alarming. It means something. And I'll tell you what it means. Open your Bibles to Revelation, the very last book in the Bible, and open to Revelation chapter 13. Chapter 13 is the chapter from which we get that mysterious and terrifying number, 666. Shows up at the end of Revelation 13. So this is a big deal chapter, and let us look at some of the imagery here. We see a beast at the beginning of chapter 13, and it is described, it's clearly a symbolic beast. There's nothing on earth that looks or behaves like this. But I'm going to read verses 1, 2, and 3, okay? The Bible says, "Then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard, his feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. The dragon," and remember who's the dragon? That's the devil. "The dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. And I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed. And all the world marveled and followed the beast." Okay. What in the world does that mean? Well, again, like everything else, there is a much lengthier Bible study that we can have. But all of those animals that we saw that constitute this beast's body, a leopard, a bear, and a lion, those same animals are found in a different prophecy way back in the Old Testament book of, wait, I'll give you 2 guesses. What are we talking about over and over with prophecy? Right, Daniel. We'll find those same animals in the book of Daniel, chapter 7. And I'm just going to tell you right now, we're not going to study out that link in this particular episode, but that link is real. Daniel 7 and Revelation 13 are like siblings, cousins at best, or at worst, I mean. They go together. They help to define and understand each other. So whatever's going on way back in Daniel 7 is happening to an extreme in Revelation 13. And this beast, as we saw, it has several different heads. And so it's not just one entity or one person, it is a conglomeration of several different ideas or nations or people or characters, all kind of joined together into this one power at the end of time. And we saw a detail where one of those heads had been killed, but then resurrected. The mortal wound had been healed. So what does all of that mean? I'm going to give you some European history here, and you're about to hear, so I'm just going to tell you from the beginning. I think the Catholic Church system is very important, prophetically speaking. Like, it's all over the Bible, not always in a good way, but that the Bible accurately predicts the entirety of the Middle Ages period and all of the persecutions that came forth from the hand of the Pope and the Church. So none of that was accidental. That was all of it was prophetically guaranteed, and um, and it's coming back. That's essentially what Revelation 13 is telling us: is those persecutions of the past will resurrect, and it will be that conflict that ultimately ushers in the return of Jesus Christ. So European history is as follows. The Catholic Church system dominated all of European politics for like 1200 years, from the 500s AD to the late 1700s AD. And then something happened. How much detail should I give? All right, in the 1500s, Martin Luther sparked what has come to be known as the Protestant Reformation, and there were some other leaders who were partnering with him to make this Reformation happen. But that threw European politics into like the blender, and everything was upended after that. For a couple hundred years following the death of Martin Luther and the other kind of original leaders, all of Europe just fell into this warfare. Protestants versus Catholics, over and over and over again, and took the form of strictly religion over here, took the form of my city is Protestant, your city is Catholic, so we fight. It took lots of different forms, but ultimately, for like 200 years, Europe was just a bloodbath. And the end result of that was in the mid 1700s or so, there was now this huge anti-Christian sentiment that was brewing and bubbling up in various parts around Europe, specifically in France. So when the French Revolution happened in the late 1700s, it was a revolution that was very specifically anti the church. And we talked about that in our first episode as well. That's where we get the terms right and left. It was from the position of the French parliament or government or whatever they called it at the time. And the people on the left of how they were all set up were the ones who were against the church. The people on the right were the ones who were for the church. And that language has stuck with us even 200 odd years later. In the French Revolution, the Catholic Church was stripped of all of its political power. Specifically, Napoleon's brother, Berthier, who was the leader of the army, he took the French army down to the Vatican, stormed the Vatican, took the Pope captive as a prisoner, and I believe he died in prison. And as a result of that, the Catholic Church has never enjoyed the same kind of political dominance and imperial position over Europe the way that it did all through the Middle Ages. In other words, it's like it received a deadly wound. And the relationship of the church to the continent was changed after that. So now it's just a church again. It can no longer influence the rise and fall of kings. It can no longer do what it enjoyed doing for 1,200 years. But the church was not satisfied with that. So shortly after that, in the 1800s, they called a council. They called it Vatican I. And in the Vatican I council, they made lots of rather famous statements like how the Pope has infallibility, that he is, in fact, Jesus Christ walking on earth, clothed in a veil of flesh. These are actual things that came out of the Catholic bishops' mouths and on paper in the context of the Vatican I Council. Well, so clearly the church wants its power back. And if they're not being given that power by the nations, then they're just going to ascribe that power to themselves. And lo and behold, that has worked, at least in the minds of several important people. So in the 1920s, you know the name Mussolini? He was the Italian fascist dictator who kind of led Italy through World War II. he was a Catholic. I don't know actually if he was Catholic or not, but he understood the importance of the Catholic Church. And in the year 1929, he's the one who actually gave political power back to the Catholic Church. So even though it's not a dominant emperor over all of Europe the way it used to be right now, it is the smallest sovereign country on planet Earth. Like Vatican City is its own country. It has its own money. It has its own police. It has its own monetary system, currency. It is a political power. It's like that deadly wound was healed. If the deadly wound was the loss of political power, then the deadly wound being healed would be the return of political power. So it is not enjoying the power it used to have right now. But Europe is standing right now, isn't it? And the prophecy guarantees that will not be that way forever. Daniel 2 promises that Europe will not cleave one to another any more than iron mixes with clay. So I am of the firm belief that when it all falls apart, as it is prophetically guaranteed to do, and there will be that void left where Europe used to be politically and financially and otherwise, someone or something has to step into that. And when I read Revelation 13, I read that it will not be only the Catholic Church, because that beast has 7 heads, not just one, right? But it will include the Catholic Church. One of those 7 heads had the deadly wound that was healed. So I am looking forward to some sort of conglomeration of political and ecclesiastical power, right? So nations that agree with the Pope's political outlook and desired outcomes will come together under the leadership of, or under the authority of, the Pope and the Vatican, and that will lead to the kinds of politics that we read about in the book of Revelation, Revelation 13 specifically, and onward, and which will remain in some form like that, in this opposition to God, until Jesus comes. So, just like with everything else, obviously there's a lot more to say about this, and we only looked at 3 verses from Revelation 13 today, and there's a lot more than that. But what we're seeing is a glimpse of what is still yet to come in the future. And when we see the political tides changing hands in Europe, from Queen Elizabeth to King Charles, and the death of the old way and the ushering in of a new way, let's not get stuck where our political class wants us to get stuck, or where our media wants us to get stuck. Let us recognize this is just another building block in a story that God told us about thousands of years ago. That God is in control. Not King Charles. God is the one who is really in control. He's got it all in his hand. And even though it's going to be a bumpy ride, because we're in the middle of a war that started before any of us were born and will not resolve until Jesus returns, it's going to be a bumpy ride. But ultimately, as long as we're with Jesus, we're in the safe place. And I'm going to conclude by bringing our memories back to our first episode where we talked about just political division throughout our society. Because we looked at Daniel 11, the kings of the north and south, and how our temptation will be to align ourselves with one or the other of those warring ideologies, but both of them are actually run by the devil, and the only safe place to be is over there with Jesus as he hangs on the tree. Okay? The devil is running amok right now, but Jesus is coming soon. So let's you and I not fall into the Democrat and Republican trap, or the, I don't even know what they call the political parties in Europe, in England. But let's not fall into that conservative and liberal trap, or whatever, words we want to put on that horrible division. because that's not where God's people are supposed to be. Jesus is coming soon. He is the only one who is going to survive the current state of things. And if we want to survive this current state of things, let us not align ourselves with Trump or Biden or Charles or Francis or any of these other people. Let's align ourselves with Jesus Christ, and he will take us all the way home. So I know that was a lot. Whew, it's a lot even for me, right? Catch your breath. It's going to be okay. And let's give it all to God, and let's make sure that we hit that subscribe button so that we can come back for our final segment of this episode and all future episodes as well. So God bless you. Go get a drink of water, have some time in prayer, and we'll see you in our next and final segment of this episode. God bless you.